Hello, everyone. Good evening. Very glad that everybody was able to come for this session. 7 o'clock in the evening is not easy. We are doing a second webinar in our series, and we hope that many of you have had a chance to either be at our first webinar or watch the first webinar, because this is a continuation and we are building on the things we learned in our first webinar. However, we are going to do a little recap, and that's what I'm going to start with. My name is Mira King. Like Danielle said, I am a psychologist at the Leicester V. Pearson School Board, and I'm here with
Hi,
Jana.
everyone. Nice to see everyone. Welcome back. I'm Jana Gillis. I'm a mental health and family outreach consultant at Leicester V. Pearson and the Center of Excellence for Mental Health.
Thank you, Jana. So I'm going to get right to it. We'll get started. We did have a lot of questions when people signed up. You had an opportunity to put questions, and we did have a lot of questions, and we would like today to try and address them, and we will try to actually address them as we go along, and then we will have quite a bit of time at the end for more questions and anything that comes through the chat and some of the questions that you've sent previously. So yeah, you can put them in the chat as we go along. The plan for today is about 35 minutes of content, and then we will have more time for questions. So that leaves us over 20 minutes, 25 minutes for questions. So takeaways from our first webinar. What we did in the first webinar is really introduce to you an approach that supports children's anxiety called SPACE, which is supporting parents of anxious childhood emotions. And this approach really is about parents making changes in the way they respond to their children's anxiety, in the way parents are doing things in a way that allows a child to handle their anxiety better, rather than about taking away their children's anxiety. That's really the premise of the SPACE program. And the rationale of the program, and this is a very evidence-based program, is that these different things that you'd be doing, these changes that we're kind of trying to convey to you, will eventually allow your child to be able to handle their anxiety better and reduce their anxiety in the long run as well. And this leads us to many of the questions that we've had, which were like, we have questions like, how can I get my child to cooperate, to deal with worry, deal with fear, deal with a phobia? And often we feel like we need to do something or say something to the child, that the child has to have some skill in order to do it. But in this approach, it's about what we do as parents in order to get the child to be able to push through the anxiety, rather than what the child is actually doing. And this is what we're going to delve into more today. In addition, we talked about how changing our mindset about anxiety is extremely important. And that is really also part of the premise of this approach. The idea is not that we need to take away anxiety, that anxiety is something bad or something that's problematic and needs to be immediately eliminated. It's rather about understanding that anxiety is part of life. It's part of a normal day-to-day existence, actually. And moments of anxiety are going to show up in our lives, throughout our lives, at any age. And really, it's understanding that when this anxiety is showing up, we are going to be able to handle it. And kids can handle it as well. And it's okay for them to feel anxious. And when we change our mindset in that respect, we change the way we approach the anxiety completely. And hopefully this will continue to become more clear to you as we continue with our webinar. Another thing we talked about is that engaging in avoidance behaviors prevents you from learning how to cope, and it actually intensifies the anxiety. So when you have some anxiety about something and then you engage in avoiding that behavior, you're not learning how to cope, you're not learning how to deal with it. And in fact, the anxiety grows and grows and grows until it becomes almost unmanageable if this continues. And one of the things that we left you with at the end of the webinar is the understanding how supportive statements are almost an essential and underlying premise that needs to be incorporated into your sort of support for your child. And that includes acceptance and confidence. And Jana will talk more about that. And the last thing that we talked about in our previous webinar is about family accommodations. And family accommodations are well-meaning, but they end up with kids relying on parents to alleviate their anxiety and end up amplifying their anxiety rather than actually helping them. And today, what we're going to do is we're going to delve more into family accommodations, how to actually reduce them, and how to reduce them in the right way that is effective for your child.
Thanks, Mira. So as we looked at last week, we really focused on what does support look like. We know it's not about accommodating, unlike maybe some of our previous thinking. And there are these two main components that we spoke about. One part is the way in which we accept and validate our child's fears and concerns. And the other is the confidence that we convey in our children to be able to push through, and to find the coping necessary to sort of tolerate the discomfort. So the acceptance is really saying, and validation is really saying, I believe you, right? This is real. And I know it doesn't feel good for you, while at the same time conveying that your child has the ability to withstand maybe not all of it, but slightly more anxiety and discomfort than they have up until now. That's the combination is really what we mean by support. And as we mentioned last week, if we're doing one without the other, we're missing something. So when parents are only accepting of their child's fears, it often leads them to sort of over reassuring, helping them to avoid, and that's protection. We talked about the difference, and that's protection. When parents only accept that their child needs to act bravely and don't accept that difficulty that they're actually experiencing is real for them, we're being more demanding, and that's not overly helpful. So we fall into these traps. We can with over talking, perhaps over explaining, over reassuring, or dismissing, demanding, and then we're falling out of support. So this really is at the heart, of this approach, and we'll continue to sort of unpack this as we go. But we're curious to know from our webinar last week, in this quick recap, share with us in the chat, what are your experiences of using supportive statements? We asked you to go away last week and think about, how can I put this into play? How can I test this out? Or certainly if you have any questions about this concept of supportive statements, we'd like to hear from you guys. What did you experience? What was it like for you? And we can have a discussion through the chat.
So Jana, let me remind you, I cannot see the chat.
Yep. I'll share with you, as we go. Immediate positive response from Natasha. Okay, I'm curious to hear more about that, Natasha, if you could throw that in, what that actually looked like for you and what you experienced. Somebody else didn't find it very helpful, not good. Yeah, somebody's child had to go to the ER and she was very afraid, and she pushed through and she did great, right? So it doesn't mean that there's no fear there, right? Your child was afraid, but we supported her through that. Someone said I had to consciously remind myself to do it. Yep, this is a departure perhaps from what we're used to. So we need to be mindful that this is a practice that takes time for us to adopt, and to become comfortable with. My daughter was confused. I was acknowledging anxiety and maybe experience, but she can handle it. Yeah. When my daughter didn't want to walk to school, I told her, I understand she's afraid to go away from me, but I believe she could do it. But she just said, no, she couldn't. I said, I know what you're thinking, but I believe in you, but no real change yet. And you know what? The change there is you. Right? The change there is your approach. And it does take time for our children to sort of believe in this, to believe that we believe in them, and to see the results of pushing through and gaining those coping strategies. So I really appreciate these comments, and I encourage you to keep going with them. Someone else wrote, instead of overprotecting, he understood my support. This is Natasha, I asked to elaborate. Instead of overprotecting, he understood my support and had more confidence, right? And that's what we want. That's ultimately really what helps to alleviate some of that discomfort and stress.
Yeah. I would like to add that this really goes to what we were discussing last time in our webinar, that the anxiety that we're feeling or that the child is feeling is not as profound or as problematic as the distress or the anguish that they're feeling about being anxious and about the worry that they're feeling about the situation. The anxiety itself is an unpleasant feeling, but if they change their mindset and feel that they can handle it, the anxiety is still there. But then the distress that goes with it is not as debilitating. And this is maybe a good example of what Natasha just described in her
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah, I would add one more. Sometimes he pulled through and felt so proud, exclamation mark. Other times he screamed, "Stop saying these things to me." And we will see that fluctuation, right? We'll see that sometimes this feels more collaborative, and other times, you know, the feelings of discomfort are large enough that our child is searching for us to take it away. And that's okay. It's really about thinking about how we ourselves push through and take this approach and really lean into it and stick with it over time. Thank
There's
you,
no
Diane.
instant sort of fixes, right? Things take time. Things, you know, go up and down sometimes, and it's our persistence and our dedication and a willingness to continue that will lead to the ultimate, more long-term changes.
Nicely done. Okay. So last time as well, we took a closer look at accommodations, right? And if we look at the definition, as we'd said, it's really any change that parents make in their own behavior, response, or actions that help their child to avoid or lessen feelings of anxiety. And I would add, to lessen our own feelings of discomfort, anxiety, stress, you know, because sometimes, as we talked about, we accommodate based on the need to speed things up, to avoid a blow up or a meltdown, you know, or even to perhaps reduce our own stress. And this came through with some questions. We had a number of questions that really asked, you know, how does our state as a parent impact that of our kids? So we had questions like, how do we avoid transferring our own stress onto our kids? If a parent is an anxious person themselves, how do we help our child to cope if we're feeling anxious? Or how do you reassure when I'm also overwhelmed? And I think these are really great questions, because if we're not feeling sturdy ourselves, it's hard to convey sturdiness to our kids, which is what they need, right? At this time, that's really what they're searching for. So I love the awareness in these questions. Like, awareness really is that first step. It's okay to be overwhelmed. We have emotions too. We're human. And perhaps we need to enlist some support ourselves in those moments and not have to take all of this on ourselves. We have to take a deep breath, put on that brave face, right? But be sure we have an outlet for support. And it's hard to be, you know, it's hard for a person who's experienced a great deal of anxiety to support someone who's also being anxious, right? Just like we wouldn't suggest somebody meets anger with anger, right? So we can use this approach on ourselves. We can think like, this makes me feel nervous. Makes me feel uncomfortable. I'm acknowledging that, and I'm trying to search for that confidence, right? To move through with my child. Okay. So there are ways we talked that we as a parents accommodate, and these things vary, right? But it can be things like constantly reassuring our child around their worries, around their concerns, speaking for our child, you know, if they're shy, if they're not confident, you know, amongst others, that we'll speak on their behalf. Spending long periods of time with our children at bedtime, you know, leaving for school, avoiding certain places, not going certain places because of fears that our children are having, social events, activities. The list is really endless, you know, as to ways that we can accommodate the way that parents produce these sort of family accommodations. So if we look at the accommodation cycle, and the way it sort of plays out. So our child feels this distress, right? They feel this level of distress, anxiety, discomfort, and it can be for a variety of things. We'll use the example of really needing our parent to assist us, even throughout our house, needing to be close, needing our parent nearby to feel that we can do things. I'm too scared to go alone and get my backpack. So we impart this family accommodation, right? So we've decided that, okay, as a parent, I'm going to go with my child. I'm going to help them in this space. They're feeling overwhelmed. They're feeling scared. I'm going to help them out. So the child, we go with them, they get their backpack, and they end up being able to get to school on time. And of course, it serves the purpose of this short term, and it really is short term, reduction in distress. So we've got it, and now, peace is restored and everyone's feeling good. But there is this continued dependence on us as parents for our child to be able to regulate. So it really is only short-lived. The feeling there's a lack of confidence in our child and perhaps in ourselves towards our child, that they are in a position that they could do this on their own, that they can cope with the discomfort. And the message a child is getting is, I can only do this with my parents. And when we accommodate in these ways, and this is just an example, we are inadvertently sending the message that I agree with you. You need me to be able to do this. This is too much for you. So the symptoms and the problems maintain themselves. They don't actually tend to get better. In fact, they can tend to get worse. They can tend to sort of spread and jump to other areas of their lives where they are feeling that these are areas in which they cannot cope well without the presence of a parent or an adult. So therefore, we continue to accommodate and the child continues to avoid, and we get trapped into this cycle. So we want to rethink, we want to rethink these accommodations. So we want to ask ourselves when we look at family accommodations to know, what impact is this really having? Do I need to make a change here? Are we promoting less avoidance and increasing our child's functioning? I think that's, an increase in functioning is a goal that we would all want for our child if we notice that they're not functioning well. So when we're thinking about what we're putting in place, is it actually promoting less avoidance and better functioning? Okay, we're moving on the right track if that's the case. Or are we promoting more avoidance with our responses and our reactions? And we're actually serving to decrease a child's functioning or maintain this level of dysfunction. So these are really important questions to ask ourselves. As we go forward, we are going to talk about how we promote less avoidance, right? Because ultimately, as we said before, we're not yanking these things away. We're not throwing our kids into the deep end. This is not going to be effective, and it's going to really increase. But the idea and the ultimate goal is increasing our children's functioning over time. So again, how do we know if it's an accommodation? How do we know if we're actually engaging? When it comes to anxiety, sometimes parents, we don't recognize that we're actually engaging in family accommodations. And maybe in the list or the things I just spoke about, you're not really seeing yourself in that list. But what the research tells us is we all accommodate to some degree. And largely, when we take a closer look, we can see how our actions and our reactions are actually serving to accommodate. And questions we can ask ourselves if we're not so sure, like, I'm not sure if this is really an accommodation, we can ask ourselves, why are we doing this behavior? Why are we engaging this way? What purpose is it serving? Am I trying to lessen my child's distress and discomfort? Or is this just like a family ritual that we engage in, over time? We need to ask ourselves these specific questions to sort of tease it out. Is our child's reaction developmentally appropriate? As we talked about before, you probably wouldn't expect to drop your 2-year-old off at a birthday party, and walk away without that maybe being distressing if it was a relatively unfamiliar place. But, developmentally speaking, we would probably expect our 12-year-old to go to their friend's birthday party from school and not need us to stay next to them. So we've got to think about, as we spoke before, does it make sense for their age? Right? We're not going to send our child off to bed perhaps on their own as a 2-year-old. We're going to engage in different rituals and procedures than we would with our teenager, for example. Would we be doing this action if our child was not anxious? I think that's a really important question to ask ourselves. It can give us a clue as to like, oh, right, maybe I wouldn't be doing this. Maybe if my child wasn't anxious, I wouldn't have the need to escort them around the house. If my child wasn't anxious, I wouldn't have to speak on their behalf. So that's a good clue that what we're doing is perhaps, a family accommodation. If we would not do this if they were not anxious, our child would find it weird or be aggravated by our behavior. And of course, if you have multiple children, are you doing the same thing with your other children? Do they require the same? All of our kids are different, of course. However, sometimes this is a clue if we're really having to focus with one child. It's a sign that we've engaged down this road, of accommodation that may be, helping our child to sort of stay stuck. And of course, we ask ourselves, what would happen if I didn't do it? Would my child be fine? Or, are they going to experience this sort of intense emotion? Are they going to feel this sort of panic? Are they going to feel not supported when we don't do these accommodations? So good questions to ask ourselves. So let's talk a little bit more about this. If you could, in the chat, write down 1 or 2 accommodations as we, unpack this that you think you may be engaging in, and how often you engage in them, because that's another indicator of how things are playing out in our families. Is this something you have to do, once in a blue moon, or is these things you're engaging in, weekly, perhaps multiple times a day? If you could think about, how do you accommodate? What does that look like? Write down 1 or 2 of those.
And the reason as well is that when we start working, when we'll talk about how we reduce accommodations, we do want to be able to be aware of the accommodations and really hone in onto our accommodations and how we do them. And this way we can also select the right accommodation to start reducing. So this is a good exercise to start with, and will allow you to think of what it is that really is happening right now in terms of accommodation with your child.
Yeah. So we have things like staying with my daughter until she falls asleep, staying at parties. And if you feel that this is not developmentally needed, because she's not a little toddler, then that might be an example, right? I think I give her too much positive reinforcement. I thought it was helpful. Okay. And it's interesting to start to ask ourselves those questions. Is it helpful or is it not helpful? Not putting undesired, unliked food on the dinner plate at all, so he doesn't just toss it onto the table. This is a 6-year-old. I go
Very
to the
common one, actually.
yeah, it is. I go to the bathroom with my 7-year-old and I sleep with her every day. Okay, it's a good example of an accommodation. I let my daughter sleep in my bed when she tells me she can't sleep or is scared once a week on average. Easier for me to get sleep. I hear ya. Absolutely, it is. Dad put 10-year-old to bed every night, but when working nights, it increases anxiety. My daughter doesn't want to go alone downstairs to take her shower because she is afraid. I don't know what to do, so I go with her. Yeah, and that's oftentimes why we accommodate, right? It's because we're not sure what else to do. Hence why we're here to talk about this. Asking for a glass of water for my son from his friend's parents because he's too shy or nervous. Yeah, that's really common, right? Our kids are shy or nervous, so we ask on their behalf. Bedtime routine is so long. My son keeps adding the new need for my husband and I to fill. Yeah, that's a common one, right? We think of it as stalling, but really, they're asking for our presence, right? And our reassurance a lot. Over explaining everything that will happen when something new or different is going to happen. And that's an important one, I think, to mention, because it can seem, it can seem supportive to continually answer questions and to reassure. And yet it sort of keeps it going. There's no sort of shut off in that regard.
In fact, I'm going to add a little bit about reassurance, because it's one of those accommodations that happen very, very often and we don't even realize we're doing it. And we think more of the behaviors, like lying down with our kid or taking them somewhere or speaking for them, or walking around the house with them. And reassurance is the one that actually happens way more often than we think. And it's also one that is very debilitating for kids. So when we talk about reassurance, it's really what we're doing when we're trying to reassure. It's to alleviate the child's anxiety at that moment from what they're feeling. So in that moment, whether it's their fear of something that's maybe becoming, being judged in school, or failing a test, or that you won't be there on time to pick them up. So all these kind of things require reassurance, but it's designed actually to help them feel good in a very, very short way, right? That moment when you say, no, it's fine. Nobody will do anything for you. Nobody will judge you in school, or you won't fail the test. At that moment, the child is feeling a little bit better. But what happens with reassurance is that you find yourself answering these questions over and over and over again. And that becomes almost a kind of a pattern with a lot of families, which is an accommodation. So I really want you to sort of think about that. I think that one who mentioned positive reinforcement, that would be in the realm of reassurances, because whenever something is good, you highlight it and it makes her feel good and she needs it. Any others, Jana?
I take my son for a drive now 2 times a day. It helps to calm him down.
Okay.
Yeah. Last one. Child gets symptoms of feeling ill, headache, stomach ache, and have to decide how much to fight him to get him to go to school. This is a teenager.
Yep. Another very, very common one. Yeah, I work in a high school.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for sharing. So I guess the big question is, what do we do, right? How do we reduce the accommodations? Well, we've been doing them and we know it's maybe not helping. And this is not an easy thing to do. And normally if we would have someone support us through it, a therapist, somebody who can help us, it does have a better, outcome. But parents are able to do this on their own. But because you're going to embark on it on your own, I really want you to be able to understand how to do it the most effective way that you can. So reducing accommodation does not mean taking it away completely. Just as Jana said, we're not going to throw them into the deep end. So firstly, we choose an accommodation that is not too frequent and it's not too difficult to address. And particularly if you're going to embark on this on your own, you really want to hone in on an accommodation that will be something that will be a bit, create some anxiety if you're not going to do it, but it's not going to create so much anxiety that your child can't handle it. So think of an accommodation that is maybe, when we say not too frequent, it does maybe happens once a day. So it could be an accommodation such as maybe driving your child in the morning to school because they don't want to take the school bus, right? So really something that they can handle and that also you will be able to stick to it. So remember that most reductions occur gradually. So if you're choosing an accommodation that is not too frequent and not too difficult, you also start very slowly with it. And I'll give you examples of how to do that, right? So if you're saying to your child, if you're deciding to reduce an accommodation of maybe not driving them to school, and you might think that's too difficult for them, you might actually break that down even to even smaller increments. And I'll give you examples, but that's something to think about. And the last thing is we kind of think of a sweet spot, right? The child will think, and we want them to feel anxious. We don't the accommodation to be, the lack of accommodation to be so easy for them that they're not needing to sort of experience that anxiety and get through it. That's the whole idea, that they've experienced anxiety, they actually managed to get through it. So you want them to have some anxiety, but not too intense. But you also something that you can stick to, not something that will be so difficult that you can't manage. For example, this child who you drive to school, if you decide to reduce the accommodation completely, and your child is going to give you such a hard time and end up not going on the school bus or not walking to school, and then you can't get to work because of it, or you can't take your other kids to daycare, or something that is absolutely impossible for you to handle at that moment, well, that might not be a very good accommodation to start reducing. You need to find a smaller increment or another accommodation that you can stick to and does not debilitate the schedule of the household in that kind of way. So the next step is to take action. You've looked at it, you've selected an accommodation that is a little bit, not so frequent, something you can think you can handle, and you decide, okay, I'm going to start reducing it, right? So how do we do that? First of all, we would like to outline to ourselves exactly how we will reduce it, right? The what, the when, and the how. So what are we going to reduce? Well, maybe I'm going to reduce the reassurances that I give my child. I'm not going to answer them and reassure them as much. When will I do that? Well, I reassure my kid maybe in the morning, before school, and many times in the evening when they're home. So maybe I'm just going to start with after dinner. And how I'm going to do that? Well, I'm just going to say a supportive statement, maybe tell them I'm going to answer it twice, and that's it. And I'll go through that as well and give you an example of exactly what I mean. But you've got to think about what you're going to reduce, when you're going to do it, and how. The other important thing is informing your child. This is essential. You're not going to make a change without telling your child. That would not be fair. They need to know that this is going to happen. So if you're going to say, well, from now on, you know how maybe you tend to ask me 10 million times after dinner if you're going to pass the test tomorrow, and I keep answering and answering, well, this time I'm going to stop doing that. And it's not because I don't love you or I don't care about you or I'm punishing you. It's because it's not helping you. So I'm going to answer you maybe twice, and then I will not answer you again. So informing your child is very, very important. Within the SPACE program, this is actually done even in writing, that you can actually write a little letter to your child and let them know how you feel about them. Usually start with some positive things and explain to them what you're going to be doing and why you're going to be doing it. Just a short letter. And if you want more details on that, we can, you definitely have that in the book that we shared with you last week. But in any case, even if you don't do it in that capacity, informing your child is very important. They have to know that change is coming. And the important thing is to know that when you inform your child, this is not a negotiation. It's not a discussion. It's not something that you are going to debate with them. When you inform your child, you've made that what, when, and how decision, and you're letting them know this is what's going to happen. And the truth is, kids might not like it. Kids may cry. Kids may actually rebel against it. And sometimes they even have a tantrum. And that's when we go back to that last part when I said that you know that you're going to be able to stick to it. At the same time, you increase support for your child. And we know what support is. Support is validating. We know this is difficult for you. We know this is anxiety producing, and we know you worry about it a lot. But we also know that you will be okay. And being okay, or that you'll handle it, does not necessarily mean that your child actually went to school on their own that first time, or they handled the fact that you didn't give them reassurance and felt good right away. That's not getting through it. That's not the way you expect them to get through it. Being okay is that they were okay. At the end of the day, they felt anxious, they weren't happy, maybe they even cried, but they were okay at the end. Anxiety is not going to do any harm for them. They have to understand that it was a feeling they experienced, they didn't like the feeling, but at the end of the day, they're still standing and they're okay. So increasing support is very important. And prepare for the reactions, right? And sometimes when we talk about preparing for the reaction, it's not just us. Sometimes we need people to help us, right? If we know that this is going to be really, really difficult, maybe there's somebody else in your milieu or in your family who can sort of help you deal with it. If your child's going to have a tantrum and, you know, you feel like this might be a difficult evening, sometimes we do need to prepare either with support or with some kind of plan on how we're going to handle it. However, if we do start with small increments and we choose the right accommodation that creates not too much anxiety, then usually we can also avoid big reactions and handle it ourselves better than if we choose something very, very difficult to do.
I would just add, Samira, I think it's really important to also keep note when we're taking action, we are taking action, right? The what, the when, the how. When Samira gave the example of reassuring our children, we're not asking them to not ask to be reassured, right? We are the ones deciding to reduce it by not responding in the same way we have been. They may ask as many times as they have before in the initial steps. We're not asking them to do anything different. We ourselves are taking that step to do different.
We often think of how can we teach our child to calm themselves down, to have these strategies, these coping strategies, so that they can get through whatever it is that's making them anxious, especially if I'm not going to accommodate it now and I'm not going to do it for them. I have to teach them some strategies to deal with it. Now, we're not saying the kids don't learn ways to deal with it. We do that, but this is not about that. What we are telling them is that they can get through it. And normally kids, if they've experienced enough of that, they figure out how to get through it themselves. And of course, you know, if you have a child who's extremely, extremely anxious and is really unable to do certain things. And in fact, we had a couple of questions when from some of you about that. If my child is just completely freezes and he just can't get him to do anything, or outright refuses to go to school, complete school avoidance, and we're talking about these more extreme cases where probably the anxiety is at a level that you may not be able to actually target that particular behavior. You have to think of what else you can target before you target, you know, not going to school or not willing to try new things or something else that your child is really unable to do at that moment or at this time. And then you look for other things because you will, even though you're focusing on the fact that your child is not going to school because he's anxious, you probably could see that there are other things that are making your child anxious that you could target before you can target that particular problem. Okay, so we'll keep going. So here's an example. So the what? Okay, so in this case, this is reassurances because we do give a lot of reassurances. Maybe this decision is about reducing reassurance responses. So this is actually a case where I had a child who often asks the parents about safety in the house. You know, they want to know if somebody can get into the house at night, they break through the windows, whatever the reason that caused this child to be like that is beside the point. But these questions were constant. They were debilitating because they also usually were asked before bedtime when lights start being dimmed and everybody's going to bed and the child is alone in the bedroom. And they interfered with sleeping, and they interfered with even, you know, any activity in the house that wasn't next to the parents. And parents constantly reassured the child, no, and they put extra locks on the doors. They showed them that all the doors are locked, and they promised the child that it's completely safe. They had to do the tour around the house every evening, show the child that the doors are locked, that windows are locked, and that the child is safe, and they're right next door, etc., etc. But this really did not help the child alleviate this problem. The child continued to worry about intruders more and more. So the goal was to reduce the amount of reassurance responses. So in this case, it was in the evening only. Because this child was asking this question so often, they chose a period in the evening. And when this particular family, we started with just after bedtime, mealtime and before having their bedtime routine, because they could not do it after. It was too difficult to embark on it right before going to bed. The child would not go to bed. So it was just that period after bedtime and before the child started the bedtime routine, which is usually getting washed and putting the pajamas on. So how we implemented it is that, of course, we informed the child that, now from now on, mommy and daddy will only give you two responses. When you ask these questions, we are going to say to you twice, you are safe, everything is safe as best as we can do, twice, and then disengage. The child might ask again. He might ask the question again and might even start crying and begging you to answer the question, but you are not going to respond. And then, the child was also informed until we start the bedtime routine or until the shower, I think it was the bath, that is all that the child is going to get. So you remind the child that this is what you will do. You inform them the day before, you remind them what you will do, and you continue with supportive statement. So when you give those two responses at the same time, you say to your child, I know you want me to answer it again, but I know you can handle me not answering it anymore. I know you can do it. And we started just with that. And there was a reaction. This is not magic. The child was upset. The child wanted parents to respond. And we just gradually worked on the child, handling it for about an hour without any responses, and then increasing that time more and more until the child really did not need to ask at all the question regarding this particular problem. It took time and it's not easy, but this is approximately how we would approach it.
Mira, we have a question. In the case you're giving, it's apparent what the child is anxious about, what they're nervous about. We have a question. What about when a child doesn't say what's bothering them, but still cries and gets upset? For example, before going to school, she wants to bring, games with her for the day at recess, but she doesn't say what's actually making her nervous.
That's fine. That's fine. We can't. Oh, sometimes that's what we focus on, and we try to impart, on a child, please, I can't help you if you do not tell me what's going on. And we feel like we're helpless because it doesn't really matter, because today maybe they're anxious about a friend who said something not nice the day before or about a test. And then you fix that problem, and then it's another thing. When a child is anxious, they're anxious. We want to deal with their ability to figure out their anxiety. Now, barring the fact that maybe they're anxious about going to school because they're being bullied, of course, we want to make sure that that's not happening. But if we just have a child who just tends to be anxious about going to school, then we just continue with those supportive statements. I know you're feeling anxious about going to school. You don't know why. Maybe it's a separation. Maybe it's nothing to do with school. Maybe it's just separating from mom. So that you don't need to say what it is. Just acknowledge and validate their anxiety and say, but I think you're going to be okay. I think you're going to be okay and you'll handle it. And that's how we approach it, right? If the child is still going to school, then the child is okay. They're still going to school. They're not avoiding school, right? So that's a good sign. Maybe what they need now is that confidence from you to get to that next level and feel better about going to school, right? Any other questions, Jana?
We had a similar one with regards to a 5-year-old. Again, not really speaking the need, but again, that idea of these, stomach ache, not wanting to go. So I think that that covers what you just said, right? In terms of
often young kids, they do have difficulty expressing themselves and explaining what's going on. It's a feeling that they're having. And usually it's not necessarily about going to school. They might be quite happy and you might even talk to their teachers and find out they're doing really well in school. It's that separation. And we call that anticipatory anxiety. They're anticipating leaving you. And that is something is natural for young kids to feel, the anxiety around that. This is not something that's abnormal.
Mhm.
young kids separate from their parents, they feel anxious. And we want to help them get through that, right? So if they're still going and they're not um, clinging to you and refusing to get out of the car or out of the house, then just supportive statements are the way I would recommend to approach it. And
Mhm.
actually to stop asking them why, because that is sometimes counterproductive, right? Because they don't know why. And then they start looking for reasons why. And then they start going to school and thinking about why. And, and that can actually increase their anxiety. Yeah, paradoxically, actually.
Someone asked, what would be a good answer to a child who says they're afraid of other kids at school? I think to that, I would want to maybe understand, is there a legitimate reason to be afraid at school? Is something taking place that is making a child legitimately feel unsafe within peer interactions? So that might take a little bit of digging. We want to be sure that, and if this is sort of a general, social anxiety, being sort of fearful of, we really resort back to the same approach, right? We acknowledge that. We acknowledge that it's difficult sometimes to be at school, being perhaps amongst many people can make us feel uncomfortable. And again, I think what Zamira said, the fact that our children are going and doing it, we want to draw on that. We want to draw on the fact that they are getting themselves to school, they're having relatively good days. This says to us that our child has the ability to cope. And I think we really want to lean into that and highlight that for them, because that's the confidence piece.
Yeah. And in addition to that, I just want to add that when it's a child who has difficulty socializing, the anxiety comes from, speaking to other kids and feeling anxious around that. This confidence statements, the fact that they're going is very good, but you also want to have, some experiences in which they are interacting. So that would be with the help of the school. Is your child sitting alone? Is he going to school and, managing to do that, but yet he's sitting alone and avoiding interacting with other kids? So that's also important to dig into and see if that's happening, and then have the school maybe help, again, incrementally have your child maybe interact with one student at a time, or in a certain part of the school that's maybe they can handle at the beginning, and then gradually be able to interact more and more with friends. And you can also extend that to interactions outside of school to help them feel more comfortable around kids.
What if a
Okay.
child is anxious? Can I ask one more, Samira? What if a child is anxious about sleepovers when he used to love them? Do we need to push him to go anyway? This is a 12-year-old.
Right. So he's anxious about sleepovers, and he did experience them before. I guess you can decide what it is that if you feel like this is an important thing. Yes, it's a sleepover. It's not something that is essential for your child. If your child is functioning very well in other ways, you may want to not force him to go to a sleepover. But that may mean that there may be some anxiety developing around separation, about sleeping in a strange place, maybe being with other people, or just away from you. So I would explore that before I would say to a child, like, why don't you go and force them to go just to see if they can handle it? Maybe there's another increment that can be done before it's related to separation. Maybe you can go to the sort of gathering of these kids who are maybe sleeping over, but you can then just come home a little later. Or maybe you can, vice versa, maybe have the child sleep over at maybe the grandparents, and see if that's a bit easier for them to handle. Yeah. Okay, I want to have time for another example. So in this example, the what is, this is again very, very common. Kids wanting to leave school because they're not feeling well, they're anxious. And especially in high school, when they have their own cell phones, we have a lot of problems with kids texting and directly their parents and asking them to leave. Can we leave? Can we get permission to leave? I'm not feeling well. My stomach hurts. My head hurts. And we often do that. Parents often do that. And again, this is avoidance, right? So the what will be not to give permission for my child to leave school. So maybe that's where you're going to reduce the accommodation of allowing your child to leave school. And when that will happen, obviously in school days. And in this case, the planning or the how would be to ask the school not to allow the child to call you if they don't have their own cell phone, or if they call or text you, you agree to respond only with a positive statement, right? So you can say to your child, and again, you inform your child in advance, I feel like when you leave school, you're leaving school too often. When things don't go well, you become anxious. We understand it's difficult, but I'm not going to give you permission to leave school. I think you can handle the day, right? And then if your child does call you on their cell or text you, you just respond with a supportive statement. I know you're not feeling well. I know you're feeling anxious, but I think you can get through the day. And that's actually something it's one of the ones that work really well with high school kids, by the way, really, really well, because without your permission, they can't leave. And they might feel anxious, and they might have not necessarily feel less anxious because of it, and tell you when they come home that they really didn't feel good all day, and they're really mad that you didn't let them leave. But then you can say, well, you got through it and you're still okay. And by doing this regularly, it really works wonders with kids staying in school and managing the anxiety. And in most schools, kids who are experiencing anxiety, there are people they can sort of go to as well. They don't need to leave school. There are other ways that they can get support within the school as well. So I hope that makes it a little bit more clear. Are there any questions, Jana?
Well, Cindy says it works. It happened to my son last week and we didn't pick him up. He got through it. So I think that's great.
Yeah.
We had a question or a comment. This is hard to do when they're claiming to experience physical symptoms. Can those symptoms be causing real pain, real stress, headaches? And the answer is yes, absolutely.
Absolutely.
The pain is real, the anxiety is real. I'll tell you, not knowing what was happening with my child a few years back, I thought she was having appendicitis. And I took her to the hospital and realized only later, oh my goodness, this child was so anxious. This was a real physical pain. It manifests in our body, in this way. And what we can tell our children is they're not sick. Right? We have to be able to give them some of that psychoeducation around anxiety. And for young children in particular, when they've never experienced it, it can be very destabilizing. They think there's something very wrong with them, physically, and they're feeling this actual pain, but we have to help them make the connection between their feelings and their bodily sensations. Right? When you feel this overwhelmed, you can get a headache like this. You can feel like your belly is really, really sore. You can feel that your heart might be, pounding out of your chest. And then we go into those same sort of, that's the validation. And we support them that you are okay. You're not actually going to, be ill. Your life is not in danger. And we're working through the stress and the real physical response that they're having in those moments. So, and there's this fear of children not being believed, right? And this can cause increased anxiety. I don't think you really believe how I'm feeling. It really does hurt. So we do have to lean into that with them and validate that because it is real.
And we also know is that when kids do, like Jana said, actually do have a stomach ache or even actually throw up. We have kids who actually throw up from anxiety. But if we do respond to it as a problem and we say, okay, no, you've got to go home or you can't go to school, you're just thrown up. And we know it's not a stomach bug. They don't have a fever. This is pure anxiety. If we do sort of allow them to then avoid because of that, what will happen? It's that cycle we keep talking about. Those sensations will just be more prevalent and will almost be the go-to sensation that the child feels when they're anxious. Immediately they start feeling sick. Immediately the headache comes on. So it's again, it's counterproductive. And yes, they are feeling it, and we do want to validate that. But barring a temperature, a fever, we sometimes need to sort of say, well, maybe you can handle it. Maybe it is anxiety, and I'm just going to assume that you are going to get through it really well this time. Yeah.
Mayor, at what point does a child's very highly anxious state perhaps need to be supported through medication is a question that is being asked. And how do we know at what point that this might be helpful or needed?
I think if these strategies have been implemented, and if you've gone through good support in implementing a program like this and reducing anxiety and working um, on the anxiety of your child in this particular way, and you've done it for a while with support of a therapist, and you have gained no progress, and your child's functioning is really impaired, I think that's when you may want to consider medication for short term, and I really emphasize short term, to allow your child to then engage in this process a bit better. But we always start with this. This is always the way we would like to start with supporting our children, giving them the sense of ability to get through the anxiety. At the end of the day, it's the best thing that we can do for them is let them experience the anxiety and get through it. Because if they are experiencing that for themselves, the next time you're not there and they're feeling anxiety, they will know. They will know that they got through it. And it takes a little bit of experience. And that's what we want to give our children, that knowledge. And we can only give it to them if we allow them to feel the anxiety. And that's hard for us to do as parents, right? Especially when they're, throwing up maybe, or having a headache and crying, and we see them in distress.
I think this may be a great last question. To clarify from earlier, are you for or against teaching coping techniques or grounding techniques? Is it better to let them find out on their own how to cope, or should we be teaching them some of these sort of concrete strategies? I'm guessing we're referring to, breathing, relaxation, these types of things.
Absolutely. These things we're not saying not to teach these things to kids. Alongside doing that, if the child knows how to calm themselves down a little bit, if they're having a really moment of anxiety in school and they know that they can take maybe have a strategy of asking for a break and taking some water or some breathing techniques, and this takes away the anxiety, that's fine. Those techniques are great, because you're also teaching them that they've got to step back into the anxiety producing situation, right? It allows them then to go back to class and deal with whatever it is that's making them anxious, right? It's not a technique that tells them, remember what Jana said, are we promoting more functioning? So if your child is very, very anxious and he has some techniques to maybe help them feel a little less intense anxiety, well, they'll still feel anxious. And then they can go ahead and do the anxiety producing tasks that they're faced with, then you're promoting their ability to function, right? So yeah, go ahead, Jana.
No, I would just add to that. I think it's also important that children find what works for them too, right? Like, we introduce these things, but what works for one person isn't as effective for other people, or they don't find it as useful. And also what Zamira mentioned, we want children to understand that these techniques are not magic that make your anxiety go away. I remember once my son saying, "This isn't working though." And I thought, oh my God, he doesn't realize it's not about it disappearing. It's a strategy to help you cope. So sometimes I think kids can give up on them because they misunderstand and think that this should just make me feel better. No, it's a way to help you move through your anxiety, get through it, to cope, not to just make it disappear. And I think that's important when we're teaching strategies, or else children can feel like we're trying to fool them, or that we're trying to sort of trick them into something that they feel is not working.
And another thing that we like to teach kids, and we can definitely have these conversations with them as parents, is what we talked about last time and at the beginning, that anxiety is normal, that we're expecting to have anxiety. Expect to have anxiety when there's a test. Expect to have anxiety when you're trying out for a new team, or when you're moving to a new school, or when you have to do homework that is really, really difficult. That's okay. We're expecting it, and we are okay with it, because we know that it's just anxiety and it's just a sensation in our body. And if we know how to push through it, we will be okay. And that's something that you can sort of teach kids from, I guess, from a young age, from 3 or 4 years old. They can already kind of get that notion that it's okay to feel this way. There's nothing wrong with them. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. We're at 8:02.
Oh, we are. Okay.
Yeah.
So we up time. I just want to mention that that there is the last slide, I think that we sent you, sorry, this one does have a couple of books that we recommended, and also the book that we suggested at the beginning, which is Breaking Free of Child Anxiety and OCD, by Ellie Leibovitz. These are amazing books. This actually, the first book that we suggested is outlining the SPACE program. So what we're going to do next week, well, not next week, in 2 weeks' time, on our third, we will address many more of your questions, as well as recap and have you maybe share with us some of your experiences around reducing accommodations, right? This is what we want to hear from you. You know, did you try? What were your experience? What were the difficulties that you may have experienced around it? And we will continue to answer as many questions as we can. So thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for your participation. Have a wonderful evening.